Fossilized human waste should never survive long enough to test, let alone hold usable DNA after thousands of years. No archaeologist walks into a dig hoping to overturn a century of settled science. Yet a University of Oregon researcher went digging through dry cave dirt anyway, testing something almost nobody had bothered checking before. What came back from the lab still splits archaeologists today. The professor who first noticed something strange. In the 1930s, a University of Oregon anthropologist named Luther Cressman began exploring a scattering of shallow caves cut into a rocky slope in south-central Oregon's high desert, a set of caverns that would eventually become known as the Paisley Caves. Cressman worked in an era before radiocarbon dating existed, relying instead on careful excavation and comparison of stone tools and animal bones to build a rough picture of how old the site's human occupation might actually be. Cressman suspected, based on the tools and animal remains he was pulling out of the ground, that people had been living in this stretch of Oregon considerably longer than most of his contemporaries believed possible for the region. Many in the wider scientific community stayed skeptical of his claims for decades, treating his findings as intriguing hints rather than solid proof of anything genuinely ancient. Without the kind of precise dating technology that would not exist for years, Cressman had no real way to settle the argument definitively on his own. That unresolved question sat quietly for decades, waiting for a later researcher with better tools and a willingness to test something Cressman's generation had never seriously considered examining: the ancient human waste sitting preserved in the same dry cave sediment his team had already partially excavated. Understanding why that specific approach eventually worked means understanding exactly why these caves preserved organic material as well as they did in the first place. Why this particular stretch of desert mattered so much. The Paisley Caves sit within Oregon's northern Great Basin, a vast, arid region defined by isolated mountain ranges rising out of dry sagebrush valleys, an environment that receives very little rainfall and stays consistently, reliably dry across most of the year. That dryness is not simply a minor detail about the local climate. It represents the single most important reason any of the discoveries in this story survived at all. Organic material like human tissue, plant fiber, and animal hide breaks down primarily through the activity of moisture-loving bacteria and fungi, meaning any environment that manages to stay reliably dry over long stretches of time can dramatically slow, or in some cases almost completely halt, that decay process. Archaeologists studying other famously arid regions around the world, including sections of Egypt and the American Southwest, have documented this exact same preservation pattern repeatedly, confirming that dryness ranks among the single most important environmental factors, determining whether fragile organic evidence survives long enough for modern researchers to study directly. That specific combination, a series of naturally sheltered rock caves sitting inside an already extremely dry desert basin, created something close to a perfect natural preservation chamber, one that had been quietly protecting whatever people left behind inside it for thousands of years, before anyone possessed the scientific tools needed to actually read what that preserved material was trying to say. Understanding what those tools eventually revealed starts with one specific archaeologist deciding to look at something almost every earlier excavation had simply ignored. The archaeologist who went looking for ancient waste. Starting in the summer of 2002, University of Oregon archaeologist Dennis Jenkins led teams back into the Paisley Caves with a deliberately unglamorous goal: recovering and testing coprolites, the scientific term for preserved human feces. Unappealing as that sounds, it carries something almost nothing else at an ancient site can offer as directly: actual human DNA. Jenkins and his team worked with extreme care, since coprolites sitting in cave sediment for thousands of years stay vulnerable to water movement, burrowing rodents, and careless handling. Digging through sediment that had shifted unevenly over millennia meant moving slowly and documenting everything precisely. Since artifacts rarely sit in neat, chronological order the way a textbook diagram suggests, that careful work eventually produced something remarkable once the samples reached the lab, results that landed Jenkins and the Paisley Caves in the middle of one of American archaeology's most contentious debates. Understanding that debate means looking first at the story most textbooks had already settled on decades earlier. The story everyone had already learned. For most of the 20th century, American archaeology operated under a framework called the Clovis First Model, named after a distinctive style of finely made, fluted stone spear points first identified near Clovis, New Mexico. According to this model, the first humans to reach the Americas crossed from Siberia into Alaska across Beringia, an ancient land bridge exposed by lower sea levels during the last ice age, then moved south through a corridor that opened up between melting ice sheets roughly 13,000 years ago, spreading across a previously empty continent while hunting large ice age mammals using their signature fluted points. That story held up as the accepted textbook version of American prehistory for generations, taught confidently in schools and museums alike. It offered a clean, simple narrative: one specific technology, one specific migration route, and one specific starting date, and for a long time, the available physical evidence seemed to support it well enough that few researchers seriously challenged the basic framework in any organized way. Any evidence suggesting humans had reached the Americas earlier than that specific window faced an unusually high bar for acceptance, since a single unusual date could always get explained away as a dating error, a contaminated sample, or simple bad luck in the lab. That skepticism is precisely why what Jenkins found at Paisley Caves needed considerably more than one single surprising result to actually shift the wider scientific conversation, and why the announcement, once it finally arrived, hit the field with real force. The publication that shook the field. On May 9th, 2008, Jenkins and his colleagues published their findings in Science, reporting that coprolites from the Paisley Caves contained human DNA dated to roughly 14,300 years old. Jenkins called it phenomenal that anything that old could be found at all, since human waste normally disappears from the record almost immediately. That combination confirmed human DNA, paired with a date sitting before the accepted 13,000-year Clovis timeline, was harder to dismiss than a stray stone tool. The DNA belonged to mitochondrial haplogroup A maternal lineage common in Siberia and among Native Americans today, supporting the theory that the earliest Americans descended from Northeast Asian ancestors, while pushing their arrival date earlier than the established model allowed. Before we move further into this, if you're finding this interesting, take a second to subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Jenkins later recalled the paper caused a huge hoopla, launching Paisley Caves into the international spotlight almost overnight. That kind of attention brought exactly the scrutiny an extraordinary claim should expect, and the skepticism arrived fast, specific, and from researchers with real standing in the field. The skepticism that arrived quickly. Critics raised serious, specific concerns almost immediately after the 2008 paper's publication. Some questioned whether the recovered coprolites were genuinely of human origin at all, rather than feces from carnivorous animals like dogs, wolves, or bears that might superficially resemble human waste once fossilized and degraded. Prominent archaeologist David Meltzer, a respected voice in the broader debate over early American migration, publicly emphasized the need for rigorous, careful verification, pointing specifically to the risk of stratigraphic mixing within the cave's own naturally disturbed sediment layers. Other researchers focused their doubts on a more technical, equally serious problem: whether modern human DNA might have leached downward through the cave's many sediment layers over time, carried by water seeping through the rock, or even by rodent urine, potentially contaminating older material and producing an artificially ancient-looking genetic signal that did not actually reflect the coprolites' true age. Given how hot and arid the Oregon caves stayed for most of the year, some critics also questioned whether genetic material could realistically survive intact for anywhere near 14,000 years without degrading beyond usefulness in the first place. Jenkins himself later admitted plainly that his team's original evidence base felt genuinely thin at the time, since they had very few directly associated artifacts sitting alongside the coprolites themselves, a gap that understandably raised real questions about the overall veracity of the findings. Rather than simply defending the original claim from a distance, Jenkins chose a considerably bolder, more direct approach to answering his critics, one that involved inviting them to come examine the evidence themselves on site with their own eyes. The summit where skeptics came to look for themselves in the fall of 2009, Jenkins organized what participants and later reporters referred to as an archaeological summit, inviting skeptical researchers directly to the Paisley Caves to personally examine the excavation methods, the stratigraphy, and the physical context surrounding the disputed coprolites. That kind of direct, hands-on invitation represented a genuinely bold move, since it meant opening the entire excavation up to exactly the kind of pointed, technical criticism capable of permanently damaging the site's credibility if the underlying evidence truly could not hold up under close examination. According to later accounts of the gathering, critics scrutinized the site's sediment layers, the specific context in which each coprolite had originally been recovered, and the dating procedures used throughout the project, examining everything directly at the exact location where the disputed discoveries had actually been made. The gamble largely worked. Several skeptics who arrived doubtful left the summit persuaded that Jenkins's interpretation of the site held up under direct, personal scrutiny, a genuinely significant shift in a debate that had, until that point, played out mostly through competing academic papers rather than shared, direct examination of the physical evidence itself. That summit did not fully end the broader debate on its own, though, since a site visit alone could not answer every specific, technical question critics had raised about contamination and DNA leaching. Settling those remaining questions required an entirely new, considerably more rigorous round of fieldwork, one built specifically to directly answer every major criticism the 2008 paper had originally attracted. The follow-up study built to answer every critic. Jenkins and his team returned to excavate the Paisley Caves continuously from 2009 through 2011, this time designing their methodology specifically around addressing the exact concerns critics had raised about contamination and DNA leaching. On July 13, 2012, the team published a considerably larger follow-up paper in Science, this time co-authored by 18 additional researchers representing 13 separate institutions, including geneticist Thomas Stafford of the University of Copenhagen and Stafford Research Laboratories, and specialists from Washington State University, the University of York, and the Bureau of Land Management. That 2012 paper rested on an enormous body of new evidence, 190 separate radiocarbon dates collected from artifacts, coprolites, animal bones, and sagebrush twigs, all carefully removed from well-documented, clearly stratified layers of cave silt. Crucially, the team also commissioned blind test analysis conducted by independent laboratories with no connection to the original research team, specifically to confirm that the human DNA extracted from the coprolites genuinely dated to the same ancient time period the 2008 paper had originally reported, using methodology designed to rule out exactly the kind of downward DNA leaching critics had worried about most. Jenkins explained the team's approach directly, saying they had specifically separated any extraneous carbon that may have attached itself to the artifacts during the long burial process, a careful technical step aimed precisely at eliminating the contamination pathway skeptics considered most plausible. The results held up. The new evidence confirmed the same ancient date range originally reported in 2008, while also revealing something additional and genuinely significant: a distinct style of stone tool called Western-stemmed projectile points, dated to at least 13,200 years old, found at the site without a single example of the classic fluted Clovis point technology anywhere nearby. The tools that told their own separate story. That absence of Clovis-style points mattered enormously. Jenkins pointed out directly that the Paisley Caves showed no diagnostic evidence of Clovis culture at all. No broad, fluted, concave-based spear points anywhere in the layers where the ancient coprolites and Western-stemmed tools were recovered. Instead, the site's own distinct tool-making tradition, which researchers eventually nicknamed the Western Stem people, appeared to represent a genuinely separate technological lineage existing at the same time as, or possibly even before, the Clovis culture that American textbooks had long credited as the continent's very first inhabitants. Researchers studying the Western-stemmed points have suggested their basic form likely derived from even older tool traditions already established in Asia and Siberia, offering a plausible technological link connecting these early Oregon toolmakers back toward the same general migration route most researchers already agreed early Americans had originally traveled. That detail mattered directly for the broader scientific debate, since it meant the Paisley Caves evidence did not require inventing some entirely new, unsupported migration theory from scratch. It simply required accepting that more than one distinct group of early people, carrying more than one distinct tool-making tradition, likely reached different parts of the Americas around the same general period, rather than a single Clovis culture spreading outward alone from one specific starting point. That combination confirmed pre-Clovis human DNA, paired with an entirely separate, independently dated stone tool tradition showing no connection to classic Clovis technology, gave the wider archaeological community considerably more to work with than the original 2008 coprolite finding alone had offered. Most archaeologists studying the question today now consider the Paisley Caves among the earliest and most historically important confirmed archaeological sites anywhere on the American continent. Though the story of testing and confirming this specific stretch of Oregon desert was still far from finished, the microscopic evidence that kept building the case. The scientific interest in Paisley Caves continued well beyond the 2012 paper. In 2017, Newcastle University landscape archaeologist Lisa Marie Shalito led a new international research effort specifically using microscopic analysis techniques to study the organic matter and sediment preserved within the cave, working directly alongside Jenkins and his University of Oregon team. That kind of specialized microscopic work let researchers examine details invisible to the naked eye, adding yet another independent layer of evidence to a site that had already survived more direct scientific challenge than almost any other early American archaeological claim of its era. That continued, ongoing research interest reflects something important about how genuinely significant archaeological claims actually get established over time. It rarely happens through one single dramatic announcement that instantly settles every question. It happens through repeated, independently conducted rounds of testing, fresh researchers bringing new specialized techniques to the same physical evidence, and a genuine willingness on the part of the original team to keep inviting further scrutiny rather than declaring victory and walking away. That same pattern, one surprising site producing a result serious enough to demand independent confirmation elsewhere is exactly what eventually led researchers toward a second Oregon location, roughly 70 miles from Paisley, where an entirely separate research team was quietly building its own independent case using a completely different kind of evidence altogether. The second site, 70 miles away, in Oregon's Harney County, roughly 70 miles from the Paisley Caves, sits a second site called Rimrock Draw Rock Shelter, where archaeologist Patrick O'Grady has spent years conducting careful, incremental excavation work. Unlike a single dramatic discovery, O'Grady's work at Rimrock Draw followed the far more typical rhythm of real archaeological fieldwork. Seasons of careful digging, screening enormous amounts of dirt by hand, and recovering tiny individual flakes of stone one at a time with little dramatic payoff for years at a stretch. The Bureau of Land Management, the federal agency overseeing the public land where the rock shelter sits, formally announced one of the site's key findings: a handheld scraper chipped from a piece of orange-colored agate, a material not naturally found anywhere in eastern Oregon, meaning whoever made the tool had either traveled with the raw material or acquired it through some kind of exchange with people from elsewhere. That scraper turned up roughly 12 feet below the modern surface, buried 8 distinct sediment layers beneath a specific, geologically identifiable marker that would end up mattering enormously for confirming the tool's true age. That marker, a layer of volcanic ash, gave researchers something considerably more precise and harder to dispute than a radiocarbon date pulled from an isolated organic sample alone. Understanding exactly how that ash layer worked and why it settled the dating question so effectively requires understanding a little bit about the specific volcanic eruption responsible for depositing it there in the first place. What the ash layer actually proved: the specific ash layer found above the agate scraper at Rimrock Draw came from an eruption of Mount St. Helens, the same volcano in Washington state, famous for its dramatic 1980 eruption. Though this particular ash deposit came from a much older eruptive event, one geologists have independently dated to roughly 15,000 years ago, using well-established volcanic dating methods entirely separate from the archaeological question at hand. Volcanic ash layers like this one function almost like a geological fingerprint, since each major eruption produces ash with a distinct chemical signature that scientists can trace back to its specific source eruption and date with real confidence. Because the agate scraper and other artifacts at Rimrock Draw sat in sediment layers physically beneath this independently dated ash deposit, that placement gave researchers a reliable minimum age for the tools resting below it, since the ash itself could only have settled on top of ground that already existed, meaning anything found underneath the ash layer had to predate the eruption that produced it. That specific dating method, sometimes called tephrochronology, using volcanic ash layers as fixed time markers, does not depend on the same kind of contamination risks that make radiocarbon dating of organic material like coprolites vulnerable to dispute, giving O'Grady's team a genuinely independent, separately verifiable way to confirm an early date for human activity at the site. That independent confirmation using an entirely different dating method at an entirely different site, studied by an entirely different research team, is exactly the kind of corroborating evidence that turns one surprising, disputed claim into a genuinely difficult to dismiss pattern. Rimrock Draw did not stop at the ash layer and the scraper sitting beneath it, though since continued excavation eventually turned up something even more specific and evocative than a stone tool alone: the camel bone and what it suggests. Continued excavation at Rimrock Draw eventually recovered the remains of an ancient camel, an animal that genuinely did roam parts of North America during the Ice Age before going extinct on the continent entirely, with researchers dating these specific bones to approximately 18,250 years old. Some analysis of the bones has suggested possible cut marks consistent with butchering, a detail that, if confirmed through further study, would point toward direct human interaction with this extinct Ice Age animal considerably earlier than the accepted Clovis timeline allows for. That specific claim, cut marks on ancient camel bone suggesting deliberate butchering by early humans, remains an area researchers continue examining carefully, since distinguishing genuine tool marks from natural damage caused by other animals, geological pressure, or simple erosion over thousands of years requires exactly the kind of careful, specialized forensic analysis that takes real time to complete properly and convince skeptical colleagues. If the camel bone evidence holds up under that continued scrutiny, it would push confirmed human presence and activity in this exact region of Oregon back even further than the already early dates established by the scraper sitting beneath the volcanic ash layer. That layered, still developing picture, one confirmed early date from stone tools, a second, potentially even earlier date from butchered animal remains, all recovered from careful, patient fieldwork, rather than one single dramatic reveal, represents exactly how real archaeological science actually tends to build a genuinely new understanding of the past. A completely separate, more recent discovery from a third nearby cave has added yet another layer to this same regional story, this time revealing something about early Oregonians that stone tools alone could never show. The cave where fragile history survived intact. At a site called Cougar Mountain Cave, also located within Oregon's Great Basin region, the artifacts were first dug up back in 1958 by an amateur archaeologist named John Cowles, whose early excavation gave later professional researchers a starting point for far more detailed study decades afterward. Cougar Mountain Cave went on to become one of the most important sources anywhere in the region for a genuinely rare category of archaeological evidence, perishable organic material that almost never survives long enough for scientists to study directly. More recently, researcher Richard Rosenkrantz of the University of Nevada led a team that published new findings in the journal Science Advances, describing an unusually rich collection of organic artifacts recovered from the cave. The team documented 55 separate crafted items made from 15 different plant and animal materials, including what researchers believe represents the oldest known sewn animal hide discovered anywhere in the region, alongside braided cords, tied knots, wooden trap components, and woven baskets, all dated to roughly 12,000 years old, using a combination of radiocarbon dating, zooarchaeological methods, and mass spectrometry. Rosenkrantz and his co-authors specifically noted that the sparse material record normally available for this critical period in human history has always limited archaeologists' ability to build nuanced models explaining exactly how early Americans actually lived day to day, since stone tools alone reveal only so much about clothing, shelter, and daily survival strategy. The unprecedented preservation at Cougar Mountain Cave finally gave researchers a rare, direct opportunity to examine techniques and materials that almost never survive anywhere else, offering real insight into the specific craftsmanship behind garments built to protect people against the often brutal, unforgiving cold of Pleistocene-era Oregon. The needles that proved real skill. Rosenkrantz and his colleagues also identified fine, eyed bone needles recovered from Cougar Mountain Cave and nearby related sites, including the Paisley Caves themselves, and a separate location called Conley Caves. Tools specifically designed for sewing that indicate a genuinely sophisticated level of textile and clothing production among people living across this region roughly 12,000 years ago. A needle with a properly worked eye, small enough to thread fiber through cleanly without splitting or breaking, represents a considerably more advanced piece of technology than a simple stone scraper, requiring careful, deliberate craftsmanship, and real accumulated skill passed down through direct teaching from one person to another. That discovery matters directly for understanding exactly what kind of people were living across this stretch of ancient Oregon. Since stone tools alone can only reveal so much about daily life, while sewn clothing, woven baskets, and wooden traps point toward a considerably more complex, adaptable, and technologically capable population than a simple stereotype of primitive Ice Age hunters usually suggests. Rosencrantz himself has described the find as filling in real gaps in the historical record, demonstrating that Ice Age people living in North America were innovative and resourceful, adapting everyday available materials into genuinely sophisticated tools and clothing long before more visible, permanent architecture appeared anywhere else on the continent. That same basic preservation advantage tying all three of these Oregon sites together, dry desert conditions protecting fragile organic material that would have rotted away almost anywhere else on Earth, is not simply a lucky coincidence worth mentioning once and moving past. It is genuinely the single reason this entire regional story exists for archaeologists to study at all, and understanding it properly explains why Oregon's high desert specifically has produced such an unusually rich picture of early American life compared to countless other regions where people were almost certainly living at exactly the same time. Why this exact desert kept secrets, other places lost. None of these fragile organic artifacts, the coprolites at Paisley, the sewn hide and bone needles at Cougar Mountain, would have survived at all without the specific, consistently arid conditions shared across every one of these Oregon sites. Archaeologists studying comparably dry regions elsewhere in the world have documented this exact same pattern repeatedly, confirming that a lack of consistent moisture represents one of the single most important factors determining whether perishable evidence from ancient daily life survives long enough for modern researchers to ever recover and study it directly, rather than being forced to guess at these details indirectly from stone tools alone. That shared environmental advantage across all three Oregon sites is not a coincidence. It is exactly why this specific corner of the American high desert has produced such an unusually rich, detailed picture of early human life in North America, compared to countless other regions where people were almost certainly living at the same time, but left behind nothing perishable enough for modern archaeology to ever recover and confirm directly. Wetter regions elsewhere on the continent may well hold evidence of equally early human activity that has simply already rotted away completely, leaving researchers with permanently incomplete pictures no amount of careful excavation could ever fully restore. That specific, geography-dependent survival bias is worth remembering directly, since it means the full, true picture of how early and how widespread pre-Clovis human activity actually was across the entire continent likely remains considerably larger than what current evidence alone can confirm. Limited specifically by which regions happen to preserve the right kind of physical proof long enough for modern science to finally catch up and read it properly. What scientists still disagree about. Even with three sites pointing toward a similar early timeline, real disagreement continues over exactly how early and how widespread pre-Clovis activity actually was. Some researchers still question whether certain dating results reflect true human activity or whether shifting sediment and mineral interference produced inconsistent age estimates. That caution isn't a weakness. It's exactly the scrutiny a significant claim needs before the wider field accepts it, which is why researchers keep returning to sites like Rimrock Draw, rather than declaring the question settled. Independent verification and repeated testing, the same pattern Jenkins followed at his 2009 summit and 2012 study, remain the standard. That mix, compelling evidence paired with real, ongoing debate, is the honest state of this research. It's a far more careful picture than any single headline claiming one cave rewrote history overnight. And that patient, cross-checked quality is what makes it durable. Verdict. Here's where things stand. Luther Cressman suspected people lived in Oregon's Paisley Caves earlier than his era believed possible. That sat unresolved until Dennis Jenkins tested ancient human coprolites in 2002, reporting DNA dated to roughly 14,300 years old in a 2008 science paper, a direct challenge to the Clovis first model that drew immediate skepticism over contamination. Jenkins answered with a 2009 summit for critics, then a 2012 follow-up study with 190 radiocarbon dates and blind lab verification, confirming the dates and identifying a distinct tool tradition separate from Clovis technology. 70 miles away, Rimrock Draw rock shelter yielded a scraper beneath volcanic ash dated to roughly 15,000 years ago, plus camel bones, around 18,250 years old, with possible butchering marks. A third site, Cougar Mountain Cave, revealed sewn hide, baskets, and bone needles roughly 12,000 years old, preserved by the same dry desert climate. None of this involved gold or one dramatic reveal. It took nearly a century of patient, verified work to show people lived here earlier and more skillfully than most ever learned in school. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.